Charles Manson and his so-called family would become the most infamous killers of the 20th century,
The victims died in the worst way.
committing a series of brutal and seemingly senseless crimes that would spell the end of the 1960s hippie dream.
They were vicious. I mean, just horrible killings. I mean, it's multiple stabbing while people are begging for their lives.
But what made Manson the man he was?
He was a very powerful person. When he said jump, they jumped.
How did so many young people fall under his spell?
Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one.
And were Manson and his followers born to kill?
August 8th, 1969, I was a Los Angeles police officer working West Los Angeles Division, and I received a radio call at about 9 o'clock in the morning of a man down at Cielo Drive. I wasn't expecting what I saw when I got to that house.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate was 8 months pregnant.
I was the first one there. When I entered the house, everybody was dead. The word pig written on the front door in somebody's blood. It was very gruesome.
Detective Sergeant Mike McGann was assigned the case.
When I arrived on the scene, there was some wires that were cut over a large gate. I entered the driveway and found a car parked about center driveway, which contained Stephen Parent.
18-year-old Stephen Parent had been leaving after a visit to the property's caretaker.
And I went inside and I discovered Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring.
26-year-old Sharon Tate had been renting the Bel Air home. Celebrity hairdresser Jay Sebring had been visiting the 8.5-month pregnant actress.
Sharon was terribly stabbed, and they were tied together with a rope which was tossed over a rafter in the house. I continued on through the back door, and I found Abigail Folger.
25-year-old coffee heiress Abigail Folger was a house guest of the Polanskis.
Abigail had been stabbed numerous times. She was very bloodied and obviously dead. And I also found Wojciech Frykowski.
Folger's lover, Frykowski, was a friend of Polanski from Poland.
Wojciech had also been struck with the gun that they used. It was a terrible scene. I had been working homicide for a long time, so I had seen a lot of scenes, but I don't think any quite as bad as this one.
Polanski was in Europe at the time. Of course, he dashed back when he found out that his young pregnant wife had been murdered, and held probably one of the most moving news conferences, by the way, that I've ever attended. The man was just a wreck.
The house is open now. You see a lot of blood all over the place. Cradles, baby clothes, and that's all.
Of course, the husband can be a suspect, and so we wanted to talk to Roman, and he agreed to take a polygraph the next morning at our crime lab. And I was there with a polygraph examiner. He passed with flying colors. There was no question he was not part of the homicide.
Nobody knew who did it. Nobody had a clue, and Hollywood just went nuts. People were buying guard dogs, and they were buying guns.
Oh, LA panicked. All these movie stars, they were hiring guards and off-duty police, anybody that they could get to their house. I mean, it was a complete panic in the Hollywood area.
And the next night, the killing continued. Businessman Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were stabbed to death in their home. Again, messages were written in blood.
After the LaBiancas were murdered the next day, it really started hot and heavy.
There was a lot of fear and paranoia here in LA, particularly in the movie colony. Why? Well, not just because the murders were incredibly gruesome, a total of 169 stab wounds, but they seemed to be random.
Despite a massive police operation, investigators were unable to identify a perpetrator.
We did everything we do. I mean, we had everybody we could possibly think of working on the case, doing every possible thing. Every lead we had, we exhausted.
Then, 3 months after the murders, detectives got word that a young Californian girl had made an extraordinary jailhouse confession. A story so strange, it was almost unbelievable.
It was a crazy story. Yeah, it was very crazy. Susan was the nicest person you ever want to meet. Talking to her in that period of time, you would think it was impossible. I mean, she was just a very nice young lady.
21-year-old Susan Atkins had claimed to cellmates that she and a group of her friends were responsible for the terrible crimes.
If these were typical murderer types, or robbers, or rapists, or burglars, it wouldn't have been quite as shocking. But they started looking at the backgrounds of these people.
Most of them came from good middle-class families in the suburbs.
Leslie Van Houten was a homecoming queen. Tex Watson was a star athlete.
Patricia Krenwinkel sang in the church choir. At one time she wanted to become a nun.
These seemingly all-American kids had become unrecognizable to their families.
She was like a stranger to me.
Controlled by an unlikely but powerful puppet master.
This Charles Manson, this Mephistophelian guru type, who was very charismatic, very intelligent.
35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson commanded an unerring devotion from his hippie disciples. They would kill seemingly at his whim.
He did control them, and when he said jump, they jumped.
The name Charles Manson would become synonymous with evil. But who was this diminutive guru? And how was he able to convince his young devotees to commit frenzied, bloody murder? Over 2 nights in August 1969, actress Sharon Tate and 6 others had been slain in one of the century's most infamous crimes. The killers were a group of young, seemingly middle-class flower children, acting on behalf of their spiritual leader, 35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson. But just who was this powerful guru?
Manson was to have been born as an unwanted, illegitimate child of a young prostitute.
Disowned at birth, pretty much, raised by relatives.
He grew up in some very tight situation.
It's been claimed that Manson's mother once tried to sell her infant son to a childless waitress in return for a pitcher of beer.
From an early age, he was left to his own devices, got involved in delinquent/criminal activities.
When you grow up on the street, particularly if you're short and slight, like Manson is, you have to be able to learn how to read people very, very quickly and determine who you can get over on and who you can't. And Manson was excellent at that.
From the mid-1940s onwards, a raft of thefts and armed robberies would see the young Manson pass through several institutions where he was said to be sexually brutalized.
What comes through, certainly looking at all the psychiatrist reports and probation reports of Charles Manson, that there was heaps of potential there. But something had happened early in life, and this dogged him the whole time. He felt he'd been dealt a bad hand.
By the 1950s, in his rare periods of freedom, Manson expanded his criminal repertoire to include pimping young women from a Hollywood apartment.
The qualities that a pimp has to entrap, intimidate, extort, run the life of their prostitutes, rent them out, sell them, and so forth. Those are qualities that stood Manson well in his future criminal career.
Incarcerated again in 1960 and facing a lengthy sentence, Manson began to study new ways of thinking.
When he was in Terminal Island, there was a Scientologist. Manson picked up on this, and he did 150 hours of auditing, which is the Scientology term for counselling. And Manson started writing songs. What he was doing, which is quite revolutionary for the time, he started imbuing these songs with much of the philosophies that he was picking up from Scientology and also from his observations of human nature. So I think certainly Manson, at that point, he's actually left the persona of the petty criminal and he's coming into his own.
There's a time for living.
Fellow convict Phil Kaufman would encounter Manson in early 1967.
I was arrested importing, smuggling, if you will, so a little bit of weed from Mexico. I was convicted in Arizona and sent to Terminal Island, California, where my first day in the yard, I heard this guy playing guitar and singing. He sounded a little like Frankie Lane at the time.
Look at your game, girl. What a magic.
I thought the guy was pretty good. The hack, the guard, came up to Charles and said, Manson, you can't play your guitar here. There's a guitar place for playing the guitar. He says, you know, you ain't never gonna get out of here, Manson. And Charlie said, out of where, man? And everybody kept on going playing this guitar.
Part of the Manson that the public came to know was a very institutionalized person who was used to being told what to do and felt more comfortable in a confined or isolated place.
When you have an individual like Manson who doesn't fear any type of punishment, really, he's a very dangerous individual.
If someone beats you with a whip and you love the whip, what's he doing? He's making a fool out of himself. It's heaven right here, Jack, right here.
Charles Manson had been imprisoned in 1960. When he was eventually released 7 years later, the world was a very different place.
We had just come out of the 50s, where teenagers were basically kept on a very tight leash, and then all of a sudden this wonderful subculture erupted, and we all became free.
The 32-year-old guitar-playing ex-con headed to the eye of the storm.
There were thousands of young people all up and down this street, and this was all the psychedelic scene.
Dr. David Smith founded the neighborhood's famous free medical clinic.
1967 was totally crazy. The streets were jammed. People were taking LSD and dancing and music everywhere. And we had the diggers giving out free food, and it was just a total insanity, and we were in the middle of it. We did a survey of the thousands of kids that came through our clinic, and 98% of them had used LSD.
Charlie saw a good thing when he realized that if somebody ran around and talked like a guru, in that day and age, especially up in San Francisco, you could gather a group of followers in no time.
You're taught that you can't. They even teach you the words. They give you the words. Take all the words away. And don't think in right and wrong, just think in truth.
Among those to fall under Manson's spell were librarian Mary Bruner, disaffected teenager Lynette Fromm, and 19-year-old drifter Susan Atkins.
She had a tough start in life. On top of a broken home, on top of child abuse, Susan Atkins had to suffer the death of her mother from cancer. And she was, come puberty, pretty wild. So wild that her family couldn't contain her. And like many others, she headed off to San Francisco, where she worked variously as a waitress and as a topless go-go dancer. She came across Manson quite early on in the history of the Manson family. And he was able to assume a fatherly role with her, which is a template for what went on with the other girls.
Also joining the group in 1967 would be 20-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel, later renamed by Charlie as Katie.
She had a troubled childhood in as much she suffered from an overt problem with body hair, which, as anyone knows, has come through the teenage thing that can really screw someone up. And her sister was a heavy drug user. She dominated the family, so Patricia really was a forgotten child.
Patricia Krenwinkel talked about meeting Charlie, and she met him down at the beach, and he took her to an apartment and had her take off all her clothes and look at herself in a full-length mirror and say, "Isn't that the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?"
Pretty, pretty girl. Cease to exist. Just come and say you love me.
And that's it. He got her. She was his after that.
Come on, you can't be.
Like many communal groups of the 60s, Manson and his girls got an old school bus and began roaming California. On his release from prison, Phil Kaufman joined up with the group in Topanga Canyon.
Never learn not to love you.
It was, it was incredible. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Real sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was sex on demand. It was, I mean, if I just gotten out of prison, and you're pretty girls, you just want to get laid, that's a good day at the office. The music was the seduction. He'd get the new girl, some new girl who'd run away. He was good. And the girls would all sit and, play their little instruments, and that usually worked. That was the hook. It got him in.
Phil Kaufman would introduce Manson to a number of music producers, including Doris Day's son, Terry Melcher. Manson hoped to get a major recording contract and introduce his songs to the world.
Remember that a lot of people had not heard this type of music before. And Manson was not that savvy to the industry, media industry, music industry BS at the time. If they said to him, "Charlie, it's brilliant, we love it, we'll be in touch," he believed they meant it.
They may have wore bell-bottom powers, had long hair, but they were businessmen, and Charlie and the family were hippies, and they wanted to do hippie music, and it was just total chaos. It was just, the recording sessions were terrible. But Charlie always kept pursuing a professional recording.
As a child, Manson had been rejected by his mother. Now the LA music industry would do the same.
It became evident to me that there was trouble in paradise.
In 1967, after spending over half his life in institutions, 32-year-old petty criminal Charles Manson had been released into a brave new world. Gathering a small band of admiring followers in San Francisco, Manson and the group began roaming the state, picking up new recruits along the way. In Los Angeles, 16-year-old Barbara Hoyt was just one of many young people they attracted.
He was definitely a father figure to everybody. I admired him. He was a very charismatic person. Everybody gave me lots of attention. They're all very nice to me. I think the acceptance I felt was a very strong draw, and I think that was probably one of the main draws to the cult, to probably anybody.
Within a few weeks, Barbara would move with her new family to a run-down film set in the hills outside Los Angeles, a location that would become infamous.
Oh, man. It's a heavy feeling here. It was just such evil that came out of here. It's such a pretty place. My God. I can smell the same smell of those trees. I can see where the ranch was down in front of me. Over there was the corral, and back here was the barn, and in front of the barn was the movie set. It just seems so surreal. It's almost like it was a long ago dream instead of reality.
At the ranch, Barbara Hoyt would live among young men and women that within months would become murderers, including 23-year-old Charles Tex Watson and 20-year-old Leslie Van Houten.
Leslie Van Houten was from Monrovia, and by all accounts, just a really all-American type girl. She was a homecoming princess at Monrovia High School.
She'd come from a family which was affluent, but had broken down. She had sought solace in drugs. She'd also had an affair, which resulted in a pregnancy and an abortion. Like most of Manson's women, she was in a vortex, in a void.
Tex was kind of happy-go-lucky. He didn't challenge Charlie for leadership at all. He did what Charlie told him to do.
He came from a solid family background, but something happened, and that, I believe, was drugs. It just took him from a path which was leading to a successful professional life onto a completely different way.
Literally free sex and freedom of sexual relationships was quite attractive to him. Heterosexual relationships to some group orgies.
Always a conspicuous presence would be the young Susan Atkins, by then rechristened by Manson as Sadie.
The first time I met Sadie, I was sitting on the floor, kind of against the wall, and there were people around, and she squatted right in front of me and cut one. I was like, whoa. She would do stuff for shock. Though I thought she was great at the time, I thought, you know, just, wow, kind of a free person, you know.
At the ranch, this childlike free spirit was a state of mind the group aspired to.
The philosophy was that everything you learned was wrong, so we're going to erase your mind and make it childlike. But in retrospect, you could see that by doing that, then you could implant your ideas and philosophy.
Any kind of belief system you had, that was considered trash. So people worked on disbelieving things that they'd been taught, unlearning everything you learned in school. So that you'd end up basically having no opinions based on what you were brought up with. You wouldn't have any more values anymore. It's that were given to us by our parents and peers. But everything we did, it was our choice. You know, people gave up their egos willingly.
Whenever people convert to a new political philosophy or a new religion, a new way of life, it's not because some Svengali or some powerful evangelist or some powerful malevolent figure such as Manson was so strong in the way they came on and so articulate that they instantly converted people. It's always an interactive process.
They needed him to be a father-like figure, a guru, and they created that for themselves. Manson needed followers. Manson needed people to listen to him. And so they both got what they each needed from each other.
But not everyone would find Charles Manson and his philosophies irresistible.
Charles and I drove up to San Francisco, just the two of us. It was at that time when the philosophy of the hippies was, do your own thing, man. You know, don't let the man get you, do your own thing. And I kept saying that, and Charlie kept saying, no, you're not doing your own thing. And I go, yeah, man, I was like old hippy dippy at the time, you know. It was then that he realized that I wasn't programming. And it was after we got back for a while, and I said, Charlie, I gotta go. He said, yeah, you're still thinking, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I'm still thinking.
Manson's feelings of power were growing. In 1968, Dr. David Smith's medical clinic studied the group at Spahn Ranch.
I really thought that he was delusional and borderline psychotic. He did refer to himself as God.
He just hung his arms out, you know, and bow his head, and we know what he meant. Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one, and all men were, but he was more the epitome of it. He certainly said that they killed me, you know, they killed me on a cross 2,000 years ago and didn't do an effing bit of good.
In the summer of 1969, Manson would take playing God to the ultimate extreme. In the isolated ranch in the mountains above Los Angeles, surrounded by his band of loyal disciples, the man who'd spent more than half his life in jail would begin preaching an Armageddon gospel he called Helter Skelter.
He explained to me about Helter Skelter. You know, it's a racist philosophy, basically, but he explained it to me like, would God want all the flowers to be the same color? And, you know, he made it seem like something very pretty.
Helter Skelter came out of one of the Beatles songs, the words. But what it came to mean to Manson and what he was preaching, so to speak, to his followers was a race war.
We had the Watts riots, and so, you know, as far as I was concerned, he was just saying the obvious.
Anytime the word black was mentioned, his hackles would go up, because he'd been in prison and he saw that, you know how it was between whites and blacks.
He says the black man was going to win this war, but he said Blackie only knows what whitey's told him to do. And they're not going to be able to handle the reins of power, so they're going to have to turn over the reins to those white people who had survived Helter Skelter, i.e. Charles Manson and his family. Then he said, we're going to come out of the bottomless pit, and we'll take over the leadership of the world.
Charlie wanted to have his own 12 tribes of Israel, basically, out there in the desert. And he planned for a whole civilization, so it was quite a grand design.
Did Manson believe what he was telling them about the apocalypse coming? No, he didn't believe that at all. I would be amazed if he actually believed that. This was a show. This was totally a performance that Manson put on. Manson is not mentally ill. He's not psychotic. He's manipulative and narcissistic and psychopathic, but he's not mentally ill, and neither were the followers mentally ill.
The end of the world's a good draw. You know, a lot of churches preach that.
By the middle of the year, the atmosphere at the ranch began to change significantly.
The intensity level was noticeable, like Helter Skelter is coming down, like, now.
Manson's world was beginning to unravel. Unknown to Barbara Hoyt, in May, during a drug deal gone wrong, Charles Manson had shot a dealer he believed to be a member of the militant Black Panther group.
We started having guards at the ranch, you know, hiding in the haystack in various places. They had field phones laid out between the front of the ranch and the back of the ranch. Then the Black Panthers were going to come for us. Charlie was getting pretty panicky and intense and high-strung and frightened.
At the same time, the LA County Sheriff's Department were beginning to take notice of the strange group.
We had attempted to run some undercover officers in there to try to buy narcotics because they were doing a lot of things. Never had one bit of success because they just would not accept a stranger.
Charlie had family members up here on the hill watching the cops watch us. Yeah. So we were all watching each other. It was all fun. Considered it fun.
We eventually arrested Charlie, a couple of his female friends, and we took him to Malibu Sheriff's Station and booked him. While we were interviewing Charlie, we were notified by desk personnel that somebody had come into the station to try to bail him out. And I asked who it was, and they gave me a name. And the name was Gary Hinman. Didn't mean anything to us. But when I repeated that name to Charlie, he got all squirrely with us.
Detective Salerno could never have known that Gary Hinman would soon become the first murder victim of the Manson family. In July 1969, Manson and his followers attempted to extort money and property from Hinman. When he refused to cooperate, Manson family associate Bobby Beausoleil took action.
When Hinman basically said, "You're nuts, I'm not giving anything to you," so they killed him. They stabbed him and then they smothered him with a pillow.
Allegedly to place suspicion for the murder on the Black Panther political group, slogans were daubed on the wall in blood, along with a panther paw print. The murder attracted little attention, but in less than a month's time, the family would commit a crime that would make the world sit up and take notice.
My own personal feeling is the motive for the killing was a series of events which chipped away at Manson's dominion. There was no record deal. People were leaving the family. People were questioning Manson's ability to be this self-proclaimed messiah. There was chinks appearing, and the last weapon in his armory was Helter Skelter.
On August the 8th, 1969, Manson launched a series of crimes he hoped would be blamed on the black community.
I remember the night that he had called Tex, and I remember looking at them as they were talking, and it was almost like a black cloud was around them. It was dark. And he told me to take the other younger girls to a place called the Wiki Up. And he ordered me to do it. He didn't ask me, he ordered me. I was a good half mile down the road. There was a back house way back there. And Sadie had called me on the field phone and told me to bring 3 sets of dark clothes up to the front of the ranch. I showed up with the clothes and Charlie snapped at me, wanted to know what I was doing at the front of the ranch when he told me to do something else. And I told him that Sadie had asked me to bring the 3 sets of clothes, and he told me, no, they already left.
Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Tex Watson, and newcomer Linda Kasabian were headed to the former home of record producer Terry Melcher, now being rented by director Roman Polanski and his actress wife Sharon Tate.
They cut the telephone wires, climbed over the fence, got in through an open window, and it was hell.
On entry to the property, former All-American high school kid Tex Watson was reported to tell its residents, "I am the devil, and I've come to do the devil's business."
These people I knew and slept with and loved are now heinous murderers. They were vicious. I mean, just horrible killings. I mean, it's multiple stabbing while people are begging for their lives. These people who I've known, you know, made love to, are now they're killing people. I mean, boing, what a flip. Complete flip.
For Manson, he had no empathy or emotional attachment to any of these people.
The victims died in the worst way. Frykowski was beaten over the head numerous times. There were huge gashes in his head. We believe this is the weapon that Tex used to kill him. Patricia Krenwinkel chased Abigail Folger across the lawn, and poor Abigail was screaming and running for her life. This is not a nice way to die.
Patricia Krenwinkel, her only complaint is that the knife went down to the bone and started hurting her hand. It went so far down. Susan Atkins told me that Sharon said, "Please let me live so I can have my baby." And Susan told Sharon, "Look, bitch, I don't have any mercy on you. You're gonna die." So they got rid of all their bloody clothing, put on their regular clothing, and they threw the bloody clothing over the side of a hill, and they went back to the ranch. Manson spoke to them, and they went to bed.
They slept in. Everybody slept in the next morning, but the next afternoon, I went into Johnny Schwartz's trailer, and I was just sitting back and watching the Hobo Kelly in the afternoon, and Sadie came in, and by that was about 5 or 6, wanted me to turn the channel to the news. She told me to call Tex, and I called Tex. He came to the trailer, and so did a couple other people, and they all sat on Johnny Schwartz's couch there and watched the news. The first thing that came on was the Sharon Tate murders. So now I knew that murders had occurred there. I had no idea, no clue whatsoever that I was sitting amongst the murderers. Someone said, picked a good one or something like that, because it made the first story. And they laughed. They thought that was funny. And I remember when I watched the TV, when I was watching the TV, it scared me. You know, it scared me. And I was thinking, wow, I'm not in that world. That's good. Well, you know, I had no idea how much in it I was.
That night, the people Barbara Hoyt counted as her friends would go hunting again.
There was no one safe in this whole county that night.
On August the 9th, 1969, the so-called Manson family had slain actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in a bloody, terror-filled home invasion. And the nightmare was not yet over.
When they went down looking for victims the second night, there was no one in LA. There was no one in this whole city that was safe. They were going to break into a church and kill the pastor and hang him from the cross in there, but the church was locked because it was at night.
Those eventually chosen to die were 44-year-old supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his 38-year-old wife, Rosemary.
Manson had driven in the car with them, finally picked out this house. He told them that last night, meaning at the Tate mansion, they had botched it by almost letting a couple of them escape and not killing them efficiently. So he didn't want that to happen again. So he said, "You wait here, I'll go into the house." He went in and tied them both up, then went back out, told them it's okay now, you can go in and kill them. And then he drove off.
The LaBiancas were trussed up literally like a couple of hogs at slaughter, and then they were slaughtered. These were brutal, violent, terrible murders.
Leslie Van Houten told Diane Lake that stabbing Rosemary LaBianca was fun. The more she did it, the more she enjoyed it.
This fork was the fork that Patricia Krenwinkel used to carve war in the abdomen of Lino LaBianca after he was killed, and then stuck it into his chest. When the body was found, it had this fork sticking out of it.
I mean, it's nightmarish. It's nightmarish.
Among words written in the victim's blood was the phrase, Helter Skelter.
Pax told me that they'd gone to a love-in, and for me not to mention it. And I was kind of jealous because my dad would never let me go to a love-in. That wasn't a love-in, they were killing the LaBiancas. God, the whole thing just makes me shake.
Over the course of 2 bloody nights, Manson's followers had taken the lives of 7 unsuspecting victims, seemingly without conscience. Even through their subsequent arrest and trial, most of Manson's entourage would remain unswervingly loyal to him.
Everything that Charlie did, they did. If Charlie said something, they would parrot him. If Charlie put an X on his forehead, they'd come to court the next morning with an X's on their foreheads. If he put a swastika on there, by God, the swastika was there the next morning.
Only a few, including Barbara Hoyt, would testify against the man they once thought of as divine. So what had driven so many to willfully engage in such brutal and bloody crimes? Was murder in their nature? Were Manson and his young followers born to kill?
I couldn't say that Manson was born coming out of the womb to kill people, but I think that his upbringing was so bad that I don't doubt for 1 minute that it were not conducive to a good life, a well-rounded life. And I guess maybe he just wanted to make everybody miserable. That's the only theory I could ever really come up with.
I don't even think he was thinking of murder when he first formed this family, but it was a slow evolutionary process. And I think at some point he saw that he could get them to do anything he wanted them to do. And he had this enormous hostility for society.
I know Charlie was treated horribly as a child, you know, between the neglect and abuse he suffered.
I don't think that he attracted kids who were predisposed to kill people. I'd hate to think that the whole group of them were natural-born killers. I just don't think that's the case.
Do I think these women, had they not met Manson, would have gone on to kill somebody? No, I don't believe that. There's no indication that that would have happened. Manson now is a different story. Whether he killed somebody in his past or didn't, it's really unclear and in dispute, but he certainly has the capability of doing that. But from Manson's perspective, if he could get you to kill the person for him, he'd much prefer to have you do it, because in his mind, it's absolving him then of direct criminal responsibility. He's always working the system and working other people, Manson. Nothing is by chance. It's all planned, and he is a highly controlling individual.
I know when I interviewed Susan Atkins, she said she was in death row for 5 years before Charlie left her brain, and that he had absolute control over her thoughts, and they believed he could read their minds. I think what you had was a delusional leader coupled with psychedelic drugs, an alienated population of young people, and an environment that reinforced it.
I describe it as a gradual desensitization and conditioning process. And he, throughout his life, had stolen cars, committed robberies, and many other state and federal crimes. And he had these people, had them do these same kinds of things. We all can have the capacity to say no. Just say no.
Charlie, I think he was made into a monster by his upbringing, but he still had a choice. So I don't think it's just nature versus nurture. I think we all have a choice and a responsibility to determine our own fates. The only thing I can think of that's different between me and those, I have some empathy for the victims. They didn't seem to care. They don't care. I've had a real hard time. Oh, so here I go. I've never gotten past what